Okay, does God create evil? I had that question recently, and so I hear the confusion and pain behind that question. The Bible answers it clearly. God did not create moral evil. He created a good world and gave moral creatures freedom and sovereignty, and permits and overrules evil without being its author. The Bible teaches God's original creation was holy God. Uh, Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 31 says that God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And then Psalms 119:68, it says, you are good and do good. And these passages show that God's intent and creative work were good, not the origin of moral wickedness. Evil is best understood in Scripture as rebellion or privation of good. Augustinian scripture pattern says the Bible consistently treats sin as a rebellion against God. Genesis 3 and Romans 5:12, or as a corruption of what God made good, not as a created thing in itself. And then John 1:15 says God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. James 1 verse 13, God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. And these verses rule out the idea that moral evil originates in God. And Isaiah chapter 47, verse 7 does not teach that God creates moral wickedness. The Hebrew word often translated evil in Isaiah 45:7 can mean calamity, disaster, or adversity rather than moral wickedness. Many careful biblical explanations show the verse addresses God's sovereignty over events and judgments, and not moral sin. Isaiah 47, in a literal sense, God declares control over light and darkness, and blessing and calamity as a sovereign judge, not that he authors moral rebellion. God permits and overrules evil, but God is not its author. In Genesis 3 shows that sin entered the world by human disobedience, not by God's willing creation of evil. Then Ezekiel 28 verses 12 through 17, and Isaiah chapter 14 verses 12 through 15 describe the prideful fall of a created angelic being. That's traditionally linked to Satan, illustrating a created moral agent who turned to rebellion. In Romans chapter 8, verses 28, and Genesis 50, verse 20, they both show that God works through wrongdoing to accomplish his purposes. Permitting or overruling evil is not the same as creating moral evil. And God's foreknowledge is not moral capability. God's knowing what a free moral creature will choose is not the same as causing that choice. Scripture repeatedly affirms God's perfect knowledge, and yet also holds the moral agents responsible. And you'll find that in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19, and Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 30 to 32. And James chapter 1, verse 13 explicitly says God does not tempt people to sin. Knowing an outcome is not the same as authoring the sinful choice. God never says if you eat, he says when. The Genesis account gives a command and shows the reality of temptation and the choice of Scripture. Presents Adam and Eve as responsible for disobedience. And that's in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. And God created our evil inclination. Scripture locates the root of moral corruption in the fall and in the human heart in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 19, and Romans 3:23, not as a deliberate creative act by God. Did God know Satan prior to making him? God's omniscience includes knowledge of angelic beings, but their rebellion is their choice. Biblical passages describe the fall, show created beings turning from God by pride and rebellion. And that's in Ezekiel chapter 28 and Isaiah chapter 14. In Psalms chapter 5, verse 4, we read, For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. And in Revelations 20, verses 4 and 5, and Revelations 20, verse 10, we find that God will ultimately abolish evil and judge authors of it, and Christ's victory is decisive. And Christians can trust that God is holy and just and merciful and sovereign. He permits freedom. He judges wickedness and redeems suffering for his purposes. That's in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. The Bible teaches God created a good world in Genesis 1, verse 31, and that moral evil entered through free rebellious choices of created moral agents. And you find that in Genesis chapter 3, Ezekiel 28, and Isaiah 14. And passages like Isaiah 45:7 speak of God's sovereignty over calamity and judgment, not that God authors moral wickedness. And God's knowledge does not equal causation. He permits and overrules evil without being its author. And we find that in James 1:13, and Romans chapter 8, verse 28, and Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. And God promises final defeat of evil and restoration for those who trust in him. And you'll find that in Revelation 21 and Romans chapter 8. And I hope that helps. And I thank you for listening.